Hi, this is Pam from the Hooked on Sewing blog. Welcome to my YouTube channel and my video on how to sew reversible placemats. This is a very beginner-friendly, easy to sew project. Let's take a look at the tools, equipment, and material that you'll need to sew your own reversible placemats. As far as the tools that you will need, I recommend that you use a rotary cutter, an acrylic ruler, and a self-healing mat. If you don't have those, you can certainly just use a pair of fabric scissors. You may also want to have a small pair of scissors handy by your sewing machine, a bone folder that will help you to push out the corners, a metal ruler, a spool of thread. I like to use the Gutermann brand of all-purpose thread, and a wound bobbin. You will also want to make sure you have a new needle in your machine, your sewing machine, maybe some wonder clips or some pins, an iron, and your ironing board. And then the next thing we're going to do is to prepare our fabric. Now you can make your placemats any size that you want. Just keep in mind that for the purpose of this tutorial, we're using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So if you want a 14 by 18 inch, your finished size for your placemat, you will add an inch to each of those measurements. So you would cut your fabric out at 15 by 19, which is what I'm doing here. So I'm going to cut out 2 pieces of fabric for each placemat that I want to make. A fabric for the top of the placemat and a fabric for the bottom of the placemat. You could certainly use the same fabric on the top and the bottom, but if you wanted to make yours reversible, maybe a different color or for the different seasons or holidays, whatever you want, then you'll need one fabric for the top and one fabric for the bottom. You'll see here I have this yellow print that I'm going to use on one side and the blue floral that I'm going to use on the other side, which will make these placemats reversible. You will also need some fusible fleece. I like to use the Pellon 987F, which stands for Fusible, the fusible fleece, and you will need one piece for each placemat. Now you could use quilting cotton if you wanted to quilt your placemats, or you have some other options, but this is the product that I like to use here. It's the Pellon Fusible Thermalone Pro, which we call Fusible Fleece. Now be sure whatever you're using to read through the manufacturer's instructions. They will tell you how to apply or how to fuse this product to the back of your fabric. Now you'll notice that it has a bumpy side and a smooth side. The bumpy side is where the adhesive is on the fusible fleece, and we are going to put that against the wrong side of our fabric. So take your fabric and your fusible fleece over to your ironing board. Lay the fusible fleece right side up, which is the bumpy side, and your fabric wrong side against that, or your right side up, so that you have your fusible fleece with the adhesive side against the wrong side of your fabric. And then, following the manufacturer's instructions, you'll take your iron and you'll apply heat with the iron to that fabric so that the fusible fleece fuses to your fabric. I like to use a cloth, scrap fabrics, over top of mine so that any fusible fleece that might be sticking out of the edges does not stick to my iron. And you do want to be careful of that because it will leave behind a residue on your iron. So again, I'm just moving, applying pressure, kind of raise my iron. I'm not really ironing across, but I'm pressing onto the fabric. Some of the manufacturers will have you use steam with this. If you don't have a steam iron or don't want to use a steam iron, you can also use a bottle of water and just spritz the top of the fabric with that water and then press on it. I have found that the steam does help the fusible fleece to fuse and adhere better to the fabric. But again, be sure to follow the manufacturer's instructions for the particular product that you're using. And once you have one done, you will just repeat that with your remaining placemat. So for the other side, again, I'll lay down my fusible fleece with the bumpy side up. I'll lay my fabric right side up, wrong side down on top of the fusible fleece, and we'll fuse that into place. Okay, so once you have your fusible fleece fused to the wrong side of each of your placemat pieces, we are going to be ready to sew these together. So take your fabric pieces over to your sewing machine and grab your pins or your Wonder Clips. I really like using the Wonder Clips. They just make projects like this go so quickly, and there's no poking yourself with the pins. So place your two placemat pieces right sides together. Line up your raw edges, your corners, and then just place a clip on each of the corners and in the middle of each side. And you will just continue placing these clips along the edges to hold all of your edges together. So you'll have your piece of your placemat fabric that's been fused with the fusible fleece, and then the other piece of cotton fabric for your placemat that has not been fused. And you will layer those together, right sides of the fabrics together, and then just clip all the way around. When we get through clipping these, we are going to sew, and we will use a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now along one of the edges, we're going to leave maybe a 3-inch opening. So I'm just going to kind of mark this here so I remember to leave that open. But we're going to leave a 3-inch probably section open, so we'll use that for turning our placemat right side out. So put the fabric under your presser foot using a 1/2 inch seam allowance and a 1.8 to 2.4 millimeter stitch length. Do a little back stitch to secure your stitches and stitch down to within 1/2 of an inch of the corner. You can use the stitch guides on your sewing machines to help you sew a straight line. When you get to 1/2 an inch, with your needle down, raise your presser foot, rotate the fabric counterclockwise, lower your presser foot, and continue sewing on to the next corner, removing your pins or your clips as you go. Go as slow as you need to keep your seams nice and straight. I have a tendency to stitch really fast or to want to stitch really fast, and I have just found that if I slow it down even just a little bit, it does help me to have more control and to stitch my seams a lot straighter. So again, when I get to the next corner, I'll stop 1/2 inch away. I'll leave my needle down in the fabric. I will raise my presser foot. I'll rotate the fabric counterclockwise, lower my presser foot, and continue on sewing to the next corner, removing any pins or clips as I go. And when I get to the next corner, I will do the same thing. Now, remember that I want to stop about 3 inches away from where I began my stitches. And when I get to that point, I will back stitch to secure my stitches. And then we'll be through with that particular placemat, and we'll repeat this with each of our placemats. So I'm just finishing here this last corner. When I get down to 1/2 an inch away, I'm going to stop with my needle down, raise my presser foot, rotate my fabric counterclockwise, and I'm going to continue sewing. Now this is where I began sewing, so I want to stop about 3 inches away and do a little back stitch to secure those stitches. And now I'm going to trim some threads first, and then I'm going to clip each of the corners. And I'm just showing you here, I'm going to clip straight, I'm going to cut straight across, and then each of those points that were formed, I'm going to kind of trim those points off as well. This will help those corners to lay a little bit smoother. So cut straight across at the point and then cut across each of the points that are created on the sides by the first cutting. That sounds confusing, but if you will just watch what I'm doing, that'll make more sense to you. And you can see here that I'm using my little pair of Fisker's scissors, and I do keep these by my sewing machine just about at all times. It's just really handy to have a small pair of scissors that don't get in the way and are quick to get to. Once I have those corners all trimmed, I'm going to turn the placemat right side out through that opening that we left on the side seam. Now you can leave the opening in the bottom, the top, the side. It doesn't matter, just so long as you leave an opening for turning your placemat right side out. I'm just kind of pushing out the corners with my fingers here. And then I will use that bone folder tool that I told you about at the beginning of the video to help me push those corners out a little more and make them a little more pointy than they are just by using my fingers. And then once I have that just the way that I want it, I'm going to take it over to my ironing board and iron those seams nice and flat. And here I'm just folding in what would have been the side seam allowance, and we're going to stitch that down here in just a minute, but I'm just kind of pinning it or clipping it here in place to hold it while I get everything else ready. Found some loose threads over here. Okay. So I'm taking the placemat back over to my ironing board, and I am pressing along the seams to get those nice and flat. I am using my steam iron just to help press these side seams a little bit better. And I'm just smoothing out those seams so they'll lay nice and flat. You can trim that seam allowance. We left it at 1/2 inch. You can trim it down to 1/4 inch before you turn the placemats inside out if you want. But I just left them at the 1/2 inch. And now I'm just pressing on the other side of the placemat, making sure the fabric's nice and smooth and pressed and the seams are all pressed nice and flat. So I'll take this back over to my sewing machine. I'm going to increase my stitch length to probably 3.5 millimeters. It's what I like to use as a top stitch. And then I'm going to stitch along the entire perimeter of the placemat. First, I'm going to stitch about 1/4 inch away from the edge. So I have moved my needle over all the way to the right, so it's about 1/4 inch from the edge. And I'm going to stitch that. Again, when I get to the corner, I'm going to stop with my needle down, raise my presser foot, and rotate my fabric counterclockwise. I'll line my fabric up nice and straight, lower my presser foot, and continue stitching down the next side. I will do that with all 4 sides. Again, when I get to a corner, I'm going to stop 1/4 inch away. With my needle down, I'll raise my presser foot, rotate my fabric, and then continue stitching the 1/4 inch seam allowance right down that long edge of the placemat. And I'm using the stitch guides on my sewing machine to help me keep that nice and straight. Again, when you get to a corner, you stop 1/4 inch away. With your needle down, raise the presser foot and rotate the fabric counterclockwise. Stitch down to the next corner, and we're going to do the same thing. Stop with the needle down, raise the presser foot, and rotate the fabric. Now I will stitch to where I began my stitching, back stitch just a little to secure those stitches. And then I'll be done with this first row of top stitching. My sewing machine has what's called a lock stitch, so it will make 3 stitches in a row in the same spot. And I just find that to be a little neater sometimes than back stitching. So grab those threads. If you don't like your threads kind of bunching up on the bottom of your fabric like this, if you hold on to your bobbin and your top thread when you start stitching, it will prevent this. So I'll repeat that with each of the placemats that I'm sewing. But next I'm going to add a second row of stitching. So I'm going to line up my presser foot with that first row of stitching. Move my needle over to the center position and then stitch all the way around the placemat again. This will give it a second row of stitching, and I just think that it gives it a little more professional or finished look to the placemats by having this second row of stitching. So the first row was about 1/4 of an inch away. This second row of stitching is probably about 3/4 of an inch away. So you're about 1/2 inch away from your original row of stitching. And just stitch all the way around, again using that longer top stitch, 3.0 to 3.5 millimeter stitch length.
Would you like to know how to make a placemat?
Again, when you get to the corner, stop with your needle down, rotate your fabric counterclockwise, and continue sewing to the next corner. And do that along all 4 edges of the placemat. When you get back to the beginning, you will secure your stitches and you will be finished with that placemat. And you will do the same process with each placemat that you're sewing.
But you gotta admit,
these really do come together quickly because we're not doing any quilting, we're not doing any binding, we're just basically taking 2 pieces of fabric, one of which we fused some fusible fleece to, and then we're sewing those 2 pieces of fabric together and then doing a little bit of top stitching around each placemat. You could finish one of these easily in 15 minutes. And if you have several to make, it makes it go a lot quicker if you just kind of do an assembly process with sewing them together.
Does it tie it or?
No, that causes it to knot off.
Oh.
Kind of.
So I'm just finishing up this last section of the top stitching, stitching down to my corner. Stopping with my needle in the down position, rotate my fabric, lower my, well, not quite there.
Oh, is it?
Okay.
My machine
Went a little too far. I'm going to back stitch a little bit, rotate my fabric, continue stitching. And then when I get back to where I started, I'm going to secure those stitches.
When I first got the sewing machine, I did nothing. I didn't use the foot pedal at all.
And then we are done with that placemat.
Just because I wanted to.
So here is the finished placemat. Let me zoom in so you can see my 2 rows of stitching. 1/4 inch and then about 3/4 of an inch away, I did my second row of stitching. And I just think that gives the placemat a little bit more stability around the edges and helps to give it a little more finished or polished look to the finished placemat. And you can see that I used a longer stitch length than what you would do for piecing the fabric together or the placemat together. And here you see my finished placemat, the back side of it, and here you can see the stitching, and here my placemat, you can see it in use. I hope you enjoyed this YouTube video tutorial on how to sew a reversible placemat. If you did, be sure to like it, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and please come visit me over on the Hooked on Sewing blog. Thank you.